In this video, we're going to explain what recency bias is. We're going to apply that to weeks 1 and week 2 of the NFL season. I'm also going to give you all my lines for NFL and all my leans. And if you understand recency bias in sports handicapping, this can save you a ton of money and potentially make you a lot of money in NFL. My name is MGCovers. Welcome to this video. Greatly appreciate you tuning in. Before we start, I do want to mention today is Friday. If you follow me on Instagram, MGCovers, cover spelled with the Z, I give out all my lines for all sports, all my lines for Major League Baseball. I'm going to give all my lines for NFL. In this video, we'll have lines for soccer as well as WNBA. So if you simply follow me on Instagram, you get a ton of value. All right, so first off, before we talk about recency bias, we need to explain what recency bias is in sports handicapping. Recency bias, a very simple definition, is an overreaction to the most recent game. In NFL, there's a ton of recency bias because they only play one game per week. We're going to first look at last week's games and explain how that relates to week 2 of the NFL season. All right, so first game we're going to look at, let's look at Carolina, New Orleans last week. Now, what you see here, Carolina, New Orleans, obviously New Orleans won in a blowout 47-10. But what I want you to pay close attention to is the line movement. Now, this is sportsbookreview.com. They basically show all the offshore books. There are a few sharp books in here, Bookmaker as well as Pinnacle. And when you see this opening line, this is consensus, meaning basic and average of all the opening lines of all these books. So that means different books would have different opening lines, but for the sake of this video, we're going to show it just like they present it. So the opening line for Carolina, New Orleans last week, when that line opened, was +5. And look what happened to the line movement. We'll use Bookmaker. It moves in favor of Carolina down to 3.5. Now, why was this? Probably because a lot of expectations for Bryce Young and very little expectations for New Orleans. Now, what happened was New Orleans blew Carolina out 47-10. So now what I want to do is I want to fast forward to week 2 and we'll look at this line for Carolina as well as New Orleans. So first off, look at New Orleans up there at the top. New Orleans playing Dallas, who won convincingly over Cleveland. The line for the New Orleans-Dallas game opened at 6.5. Now look what happened. It moves down 0.5 point in favor of New Orleans. Now let's find Carolina. Look at Carolina's playing the Chargers. That line opened at 4.5, and where has that line moved? It has moved to 5. So you see what I'm saying? New Orleans wins in a blowout. The next week, line moves in their favor. You take a look at Carolina. Carolina got blown out. Line moves against them. So going back to week 1, and this is a pretty good one here, Minnesota. They win 28-6 over the Giants. So now we'll go to week 2. And we'll see what happened. And you can probably already guess, right? Take a look at Minnesota playing San Francisco, and look what happens. It opens at 5, and it moves down to 4.5. So now you're starting to understand what recency bias is. And again, another reason why, I'm a big line movement guy, and that's how I learned the importance of line movement. But I would say, especially early on in the season, I don't think necessarily we can classify this as, quote, sharp movement. It would basically be what I'd classify as a public line move because of the recency bias. New York Jets. Week 1, so a lot of expectation, a lot of hype surrounding Aaron Rodgers coming back from an injury. And this is super fascinating. This line opened at +6, moved all the way down to 3.5, right? Big line move in favor of the Jets. What happened? Jets got blown out. San Francisco wins convincingly 32-19. What's going to happen to the line for the Jets? Is it going to move in favor of the Jets or is it going to move against the Jets? So just understanding this, you're already ahead of the majority of people that wager on sports. The line's going to move against the Jets, right? Because of the recency bias. So let's go to week 2, find the Jets here. Jets are playing Tennessee. It opens at -4 and moves down to 3.5. And I actually have Jets heavily favored via my model. And that's going to be probably more than likely a potential play in favor of the Jets, although the line has moved against the Jets. All right, and let's do one more last one before we get into my lines. Let's take a look at Atlanta from week 1, Atlanta and Pittsburgh. And this is super fascinating to study this because once you understand this, and this is applicable I mean, line movement will get sharper as the season progresses, but early on, there's a ton of recency bias. And then you'll still have recency bias in NFL, and that's why it's important to note this. And I would still say that let me see if I agree. I was getting ready to make a bold statement here. I would still say that if you're trying to find what the sharpest move is, because it's hard to distinguish between, is it the public overreacting to what happened the previous week, or is that actually sharp movement off of the opening line? I just think it's probably easier to identify sharp movement late and subtle, which is what I teach, meaning like for a 1 o'clock game, line opened at, say the line's at 3 + 3, the line moves to 2.5, 30 minutes before the game. That's a clear example, majority of time, of sharp movement. Atlanta and Pittsburgh. So Atlanta opened at -3. The line moves in favor of Atlanta up to -4. And what happens? They lose 18-10. Was the line going to move in favor of Atlanta, or is it going to move against Atlanta? It's going to move against Atlanta in week 2, more than likely. There's nothing 100% in sports betting. So we say majority of the time. And we scroll way down till we find Atlanta and Philadelphia down here at the bottom. Huge move, right? So it opened at 4.5, and now it's all the way up to 2.5, a 2-point line move, which is significant, right? So recency bias, very important to understand that concept. So let's dive into my model and we'll take a look at some of these. This is what I call a subjective model, which means it's not statistically based. So there is some quote bias factored into this, but it's actually, I think it's a pretty good model. We had 4 potential plays last year. I didn't wager on NFL. I probably won't start until maybe like week 3, even potentially week 4, because I want my model to have sufficient data. However, just to stretch and grow, this is brand new subjective model for me. We had 4 potential plays last week. Now, the good news, all 4 won. And we know the statistical property of NFL. If teams win in the NFL, there's an 80% chance they cover. Unfortunately, only 4 teams. There were 4 teams in NFL that won but didn't cover, and 3 of them were potential plays we had. The only actual play that won was Minnesota. So the good sign was that all 4 of the suggested plays that we had actually won, but they didn't cover. So hypothetically, if you understand probability and regression to the mean, majority of time, those plays would have won and covered. All right, so we'll dive into it. Buffalo, Miami, we had that as a tight game, small favorite there for Buffalo. Buffalo won big there. New Orleans and Dallas. Again, that line has moved in favor of New Orleans. However, I think Dallas is a really strong play here. If you look at my power ranking, I basically I give the top team a power ranking of 32. There's 32 teams in the NFL. And then we basically subtract each team's power ranking to give us a, quote, hypothetical line. So Dallas in this situation is -14. You actually look at the sportsbook line. Yeah, we already saw this. Yeah, and it's 6. So basically Dallas has to win by a touchdown in order to cover that. So definitely a strong lean in favor of Dallas. And I will mention this too. If you go to my Instagram account, I may post this again. There's a link. I give you all my line. This actual page where I show all my lines, you can actually click that link and it pops up. So if you want to see that, or actually look at it now while I'm going through this video. So lean on Dallas. Let's go back to the power rankings now. Las Vegas and Baltimore. We have Baltimore as a 30. Vegas is a 5 power ranking, so we have a huge line for Baltimore -25. I would say realistically, I wouldn't really make that line -25. I would probably cap it at 14. So if I was actually making this my model, I would cap all these lines probably at 14. Because, again, why? It's very difficult to beat a team by more than a touchdown. And we go over to the actual line here with Vegas and Baltimore. Lines moved in favor of Baltimore, -9. However, I generally don't like to play favorites when they have to cover that big number because, again, the most common margin in NFL is 3. Second most common margin is 7, although the average margin of victory is greater than that. Still high chance, high probability that those games will end in either a 3-point margin or a 7-point margin. But the point is, I rarely like to play favorites when they have to cover a big number. So that would be a pass there. Okay, let's go back to the model. We'll skip Giants and Washington. That's basically a crapshoot. But again, important point to mention about recency bias. That line for Washington last week opened at -4, stayed at, it moved around, but I think it closed at 4. And then this week, that line has moved heavily against Washington because of Jaden Daniels. And I said that last week. I would not be surprised if he went 13 of 20, threw for 150 yards, and would not be surprised if he had 3 touchdowns and threw for 300 yards. And he may improve this week, but the point is that line's already moved significantly against Washington. It opened at -3 versus the Giants. Now it's at -1. That definitely feels like a recency bias move there. All right, next one, Chargers and Carolina. Obviously, we have Chargers favored here. I still would probably steer away from this simply because we have Chargers ranked near the middle. And if you know anything about what I teach, margin concept, we generally want to play the, quote, better teams at the top of the model, where we have significant margin, very similar to the New Orleans-Dallas game. All right, next one, Green Bay and Indianapolis. Maybe a potential play there for Green Bay. Probably would pass on that. And then finally, let's move to the next one. San Francisco, Minnesota. I have San Francisco as the best team in NFL right now. 32 power ranking versus 9 for Minnesota. So that's a difference of -23. We can just say it's -14 line. We go to the actual line. We already looked at this. Even though the line's moved against San Francisco, I still like San Francisco in this spot here. For reaction to Minnesota's blowout win from last week. And even though it line's -4.5, I've said this before in NFL, -4.5, -5, 5.5, 6, 6.5, that's basically the same line. So San Francisco has to win by a touchdown in order to win that one. But definitely a strong lean in favor of San Francisco there. All right, Cleveland, Jacksonville, pretty even. My line, Jacksonville -4. Same with Seattle, New England. New England -4. Take a look at the Jets and Tennessee here. We have Jets at -15. We go look at the books line. We already talked about this game some. Yeah, I like the Giants in this spot to bounce back, going against the recency bias here. Lined open at 4. Now it's at 3.5. And definitely like Rodgers and the Jets to bounce back in that one. Jets, good defense. Again, really can't take many points away from them from losing to the, quote, best team in NFL. So definitely a strong lean in favor of the Jets. Let's continue here. Tampa Bay and Detroit. Detroit's a 29. Tampa Bay is a 13. So that gives us a -16. Now, Tampa Bay had a very convincing win over my Washington Commanders. So let's take a look at line. Line has actually moved in favor of Detroit here. Opened at 6. Now it's all the way up to 7.5. And again, that hook, that matters tremendously when you're handicapping NFL. I just think you're better off focusing on those lines where a field goal or touchdown is going to win it. And so having to win by basically 2 scores, they got to win by a touchdown and a field goal or 2 touchdowns. Very difficult to do. Even though there's, quote, value view of the line, it's just that the way that I handicap NFL, I like to make it easier on myself and playing into that statistical property. LA Rams, San Francisco. We have Rams -6. Probably will pass there. Kansas City, Cincinnati. Kansas City -9. That line has moved a ton. Again, I would be careful on this one too. Cincinnati +3. Line moves all the way to 3. Talked about this with the college football game. And generally when you see a big line move, there's a lot of public bias and recency bias factored into that. And what I mean by that is, so basically the books open this line. People that are basically set the line, that are really good at setting the line, they made this line +3. Now the public and all the bettors have pushed it to 6. Do we trust the books line opening at +3, or do we trust a lot of bias factored into this at +6? That's a huge line move. So I would definitely be wary of that game, even though we do have a little bit of value there with KC at -9. But I think Cincinnati could potentially bounce back from last week. And let me check real quick, see what happened to them week 1. Yeah, that was that surprising by New England. Actually, line did move in favor of New England, but the fact that Cincinnati only scored 10 points and lost to New England, again, recency bias definitely factored into that line movement of Cincinnati going from +3 all the way up to +6 against Kansas City. Pittsburgh and Denver. We have Pittsburgh as huge favorites. Again, I have them. I don't even think I have them in my top 10, so I would pass on those. That team, Houston and Chicago, we have Houston -7. Let's take a peek at this line here. Okay, Houston won over Indianapolis. Line moved in their favor. Let's see what's happening here. Yep, basically no value. The line's moved in favor of Houston. Opened at 5. Now it's at 6.5. So we have that one listed basically no value. And then finally, Atlanta and Philadelphia. We have Philadelphia very high in our power rankings, 27. We have Atlanta still at an 8, even though they won. So that gives us a line of -19. We truncate that down to 14, meaning Philadelphia technically is -14 if we want to create a legit line. And we have Philadelphia at -6.5. Again, some bias factored in that as well with Atlanta, but I still think Philadelphia is the stronger and better team and should win. So just to review the leans here, we like Philadelphia, the Jets, San Francisco, and so those are our lanes. If you want access to all my lines for all sports, in addition to all my coaching videos, you can subscribe to my service. We have probably maybe 180 coaching videos on the website. You can get access to all that for just $50 a month. Very inexpensive. You want access to everything I just mentioned, in addition to all my plays, $100 a month. And probably the best value, instead of paying $100 each month, you can pay $500. That gives you access to everything on the website for 1 year for $500. It's basically like getting an associate's degree in sports handicapping. All my lines for all sports for 1 year, in addition to all my coaching videos, and we upload one new coaching video each week. There's a link to join the description box. Hope this video helped. Don't forget to be aware of recency bias. Subscribe to the channel, like this video. Talk to you guys soon. Peace.